Karen stood on James Harper's lawn, her voice sharp and loud. "Why would anyone put up a Barack Obama cutout here? Are you trying to prove something?" Her words were laced with hostility, her disdain clear for all to see. Neighbors began, gathering, whispering amongst themselves, but remaining silent, their unease evident as Karen's outburst escalated. James stood by his porch, his expression calm, but his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't someone who sought conflict, yet Karen's words pierced deeply. "You think you're better than us?" she sneered. The neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke up. James tried to muster a response, but the weight of the moment left him frozen, and Karen's hateful remarks continued unabated, filling the air with tension. Why was Karen so angry? What would James do next? How would you handle a situation like this? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more impactful stories. Nestled in the heart of suburbia, the neighborhood appeared idyllic at first glance. Rows of perfectly trimmed lawns, framed by pristine picket fences, spoke of unity and shared values. Families exchanged polite greetings on the sidewalks, and children played in the safety of cul-de-sacs. But behind this picture-perfect FAR U0E78 lay a simmering tension U2014, an invisible divide that many chose to ignore. Beneath the surface, subtle yet pervasive undercurrents of prejudice shaped relationships within the community. Whispers behind, closed doors, passive-aggressive remarks at gatherings, and a quiet resistance to genuine inclusivity marred the neighborhood U2019's harmony. While most residents kept to themselves, avoiding conflict, the divide became more pronounced in moments when unity was tested. This was the world James Harper called home, a place where acceptance often depended on silent compliance, and speaking out could invite trouble. James Harper was the kind of neighbor everyone respected, but only a few truly understood. In his early 40s, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from years of perseverance. As a high school educator, James dedicated his life to fostering equality and understanding in the next generation. In the classroom, James's voice inspired change. He organized workshops, held open discussions about systemic racism, and mentored students who often felt overlooked. His passion for justice extended beyond the school walls. James actively participated in community programs, aiming to bridge the subtle divides that plagued the neighborhood. Despite his goodwill and tireless efforts, James often found himself at the receiving end of subtle discrimination. An offhand remark here, a dismissive glance there, U2014. The signs were quiet but unmistakable. The most vocal source of this prejudice, however, was his next-door neighbor, Karen Parker. Karen U2019's disdain wasn't always direct. Her microaggressions often took the form of condescending compliments or veiled criticisms. "It's so nice to see you doing something positive for the youth," she once said, her tone implying surprise. For James, these moments were a reminder of the barriers that remained. No matter how much he tried to break them, James's resolve never wavered. He believed in the power of compassion and education to change hearts. But even for someone as patient as James, living next to someone like Karen tested his limits in ways he never imagined. Karen Parker was the kind of neighbor who seemed ordinary at first glance. A middle-aged woman with a carefully cultivated image of civic-mindedness, she often attended community events, greeted others with a smile, and volunteered for neighborhood projects. Yet, beneath her polite demeanor lay a simmering prejudice, especially directed toward James Harper. Karen's disdain wasn't overt, but it was unmistakable to those who paid attention. Her passive-aggressive remarks were a constant thorn in James's side. "It must be nice to have the time to be so involved in the community," she once said, implying that his activism was a luxury rather than a necessity born out of conviction. Over The years, her hostility grew more apparent. At block parties, she would deliberately exclude James from conversations, or worse, make backhanded comments in his presence. "I'm sure you have plenty of stories to share, James. People like you always do," she'd say, with a dismissive chuckle. Karen's behavior wasn't just a personal affront to James. It created an undercurrent of tension within the neighborhood. Her actions set an example for others who might have harbored similar biases but lacked the boldness to express them openly. For James, Karen was a constant reminder that even in seemingly progressive spaces, prejudice could persist, hidden behind a veneer of civility. Maria Lopez was one of the few people in the neighborhood who truly understood James's struggles. As a Latina woman who had faced her own share of biases, Maria empathized with the challenges James encountered. She was a warm and vibrant presence, always ready to offer a kind word or a listening ear when James needed it most. Maria didn't just sympathize, she actively supported James in his efforts to foster unity and awareness, whether it was attending one of his workshops or standing by his side during tense neighborhood meetings. Maria was unwavering in her commitment to fairness and justice. "James, you've got to stop letting Karen get under your skin," Maria would say, her tone firm, yet caring. "People like her thrive on making others feel small. Don't give her that power." Her courage to speak out against injustice made her a rare ally in a community often reluctant to address its underlying issues. Maria's friendship gave James strength, reminding him that he wasn't alone in his fight for a better, more inclusive neighborhood. Officer David Jenkins had built a reputation as a fair and level-headed figure in the community. A tall, soft-spoken man in his mid-40s, he prided himself on his impartiality in all matters, often describing himself as a man of the law, not of opinion. His calm demeanor and even-handedness had earned him the respect of many in the neighborhood, including James. Yet for all his virtues, David's neutrality often came at a cost. When incidents of prejudice arose, he would choose to remain on the sidelines, opting for a hands-off approach. "I'm here to keep the peace, not take sides," he would say whenever asked to mediate disputes. For James, this reluctance to confront prejudice directly was disheartening. While David's impartiality shielded him from conflict, it also symbolized the broader societal indifference that allowed systemic racism to persist unchecked. James often found himself wondering if David's neutrality stemmed from genuine caution or an unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths. James Harper's journey into activism began long before he moved into the neighborhood. Growing up in a working-class family in the South, he witnessed the harsh realities of systemic racism firsthand. From being unfairly treated at school to watching his father lose job opportunities due to discriminatory hiring practices, James learned early on that equality was a privilege, not a given. Fueled by these experiences, James devoted his life to creating change. As a young man, he organized protests, volunteered at community centers, and spoke at public forums about the need for racial justice. His passion for equality eventually led him to a career in education, where he believed he could make the greatest impact. As a high school teacher, James became a mentor to countless students, using his own experiences to inspire resilience and courage. His efforts extended beyond the classroom. He frequently led workshops, collaborated with local activists, and built bridges between diverse groups within his community. Despite his accomplishments, James's role as a vocal advocate for justice often made him a target. Subtle acts of discrimination, like being passed over for leadership opportunities or enduring backhanded compliments, were a constant reminder that the fight for equality was far from over. Yet James's unwavering commitment to his cause remained his greatest strength, driving him to persevere even in the face of adversity. Karen's hostility toward James often played out in subtle, calculated ways that were difficult to confront directly. At neighborhood events, she would make snide remarks, barely veiled behind a polite tone. "Oh, James, you must love all this attention," she once said, when his work was recognized at a community meeting. Her words, though framed as a compliment, carried an undertone of mockery. Karen often questioned James's integrity, suggesting his activism was more about self-promotion than genuine concern. "Do you really think you're making a difference, or is it just for show?" she asked during a neighborhood discussion on diversity. These microaggressions, while seemingly minor, had a cumulative effect on James's peace of mind. They created a hostile environment where he constantly felt scrutinized and undermined, even in spaces meant to foster unity. Karen's actions didn't go unnoticed, but the community's response was far from unified. A handful of neighbors quietly supported James, offering encouraging words in private, but most chose to remain passive. Their reluctance to confront Karen's behavior only emboldened her further, making the neighborhood's divide more apparent. Some residents avoided taking sides, reasoning that Karen's actions weren't serious enough to warrant confrontation. Others subtly distanced themselves from James, worried about becoming targets of Karen's hostility. The community's inaction allowed the tensions to simmer, leaving James increasingly isolated. This unease set the stage for the eventual escalation, as the divide grew deeper and the stakes higher. The question wasn't if the situation would explode, but when. Have you ever lived near someone who made you feel unwelcome? How did you handle it? Share your experiences in the comments and let's discuss how we can create more inclusive communities together. Karen's disdain for James Harper began to spill beyond passive-aggressive remarks into outright slander. She started small, dropping subtle insinuations about him during casual conversations with neighbors. "You know, I've heard James is using his community workshops to make himself look good for political connections," she said to one neighbor, her voice dripping with feigned concern. At first, her words were dismissed by many as baseless gossip, but Karen was persistent. Over time, her accusations grew bolder. "Do you ever wonder why he's so invested in those kids? It just feels off to me," she murmured to another neighbor during a coffee meetup. With every whisper, she sowed seeds of doubt, slowly eroding the goodwill James had built over years. Her campaign of lies wasn't limited to verbal rumors. Karen used social media as a tool, posting cryptic comments on neighborhood forums. "Some people in this community act like heroes, but not everything is as it seems," she wrote, clearly targeting James without mentioning his name. The ambiguity of her posts made them more insidious, as they invited speculation without directly accusing him. For James, the shift was palpable. Neighbors who once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact or offered curt nods. A few even cancelled their participation in his workshops, citing vague excuses. James overheard snippets of conversations at gatherings that left him questioning how deeply Karen's rumors had taken root. Maria, ever vigilant, noticed the change in the neighborhood's behavior toward James and confronted him. "She's poisoning people's minds, James," Maria said, frustration evident in her tone. "You need to speak up and shut this down before it gets worse." James shook his head, his expression weary. "I don't want to stoop to her level, Maria. I've always believed that the truth speaks louder than lies. People will see through her eventually, but Karen wasn't giving up so easily. The mistrust she had planted was beginning to spread, creating fractures in the once cordial relationships James had with his neighbors. The growing isolation was as painful as it was unfair, and James couldn't help but wonder how much more damage Karen could do before the truth finally came to light. One morning, James Harper stepped outside to grab the mail and stopped in his tracks. His mailbox, once pristine, was now dented and hanging at an odd angle. He frowned, inspecting the damage. It wasn't the kind of dent caused by an accidental bump. It looked deliberate. Karen Parker, strolling by with her morning coffee, paused to take in the scene. "Oh, looks like a delivery truck wasn't paying attention," she remarked with a smirk barely concealed behind her faux concern. "You should be more careful where you place your mailbox, James." James knew better than to engage her. "Thanks for the advice, Karen," he replied calmly, though his jaw tightened. He couldn't prove it, but he felt certain this was no accident. Over the next few weeks, the incidents became more frequent. One evening, he found a long scratch running down the side of his car, as if someone had dragged a sharp object across it. On another morning, he noticed a patch of graffiti sprayed onto the sidewalk near his home. The word was vague enough to avoid explicit accusations, but carried a tone that felt pointed. James reported the incidents to the neighborhood association and the local police, but the responses were lackluster. "It's unfortunate," Officer David Jenkins said when James showed him the photos, "but without direct evidence, there's not much we can do." Maria was furious. "This isn't random vandalism, James," she said during one of their conversations. "It's harassment. Karen's behind this. I know it." "I know it too," James admitted, frustration creeping into his voice. "But without proof, all I have are suspicions. She's careful. Everything she does is subtle enough to avoid direct blame." Karen, meanwhile, continued to feign innocence. When James brought up the incidents during a neighborhood meeting, she laughed lightly. "Oh, James, you can't seriously think anyone in this neighborhood would do such things. Maybe it's time to invest in better security cameras." Her tone was mocking, her words laced with condescension. Each act of vandalism chipped away at James's peace of mind. His home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a target. The psychological toll was immense, but James resolved not to let Karen's campaign of intimidation break him. He knew he had to endure until the day her actions would expose her for what she truly was. Karen Parker, ever the manipulator, began working her charm on a few impressionable neighbors. She singled out those who were already susceptible to her worldview, subtly planting seeds of doubt about James Harper. Over coffee chats and casual meetups, she twisted her narrative further. "I'm not saying James is a bad guy," she would begin, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "But have you ever wondered why he's so involved in everything? It just seems calculated." Her words began to take root. Some neighbors who had once waved warmly at James started avoiding him, their smiles replaced with uncomfortable glances. Karen's closest confidants became her echo chamber, repeating her lies and amplifying her prejudice. During a book club meeting, one of them casually remarked, "I heard James is just using those community workshops to make himself look good. It's all about appearances with him." Karen's faction was small but vocal, and their influence spread like a quiet storm. They whispered amongst themselves at neighborhood events, creating an atmosphere of exclusion that was impossible for James to ignore. James noticed the shift. The once welcoming faces in his community seemed colder, more distant. Maria noticed it too. "She's poisoning people's minds, James," Maria said one evening, frustration heavy in her voice. "But people will see through her lies eventually. They have to." "I hope you're right," James replied, though the weight of the situation was evident in his tone. For now, Karen's efforts to divide the community seemed to be working, creating a growing rift that left James feeling increasingly isolated. Amid the escalating hostility, James Harper chose to stand firm, refusing to let Karen's actions define him. While others might have retaliated, James believed in the power of resilience and kindness. He continued to show up at neighborhood events, greeting neighbors with warmth, even when some avoided his gaze. At one such gathering, a neighbor who had started keeping their distance muttered, "I don't know how he keeps coming around with everything going on." James overheard, but let the comment roll off his back, responding with a polite, "Good to see you too, Mark." Maria, ever his ally, marveled at his composure. "James, I don't know how you do it," she said one evening. "All this negativity and you still hold your head high." James gave her a small smile. "It's not easy, Maria, but I've learned that responding with grace speaks louder than any argument. Karen's words might divide some, but they won't break me." He continued his activism, organizing workshops and mentoring students, ensuring that his actions reflected the values he stood for. His presence became a quiet defiance, a reminder that integrity could withstand even the most insidious attacks. Karen, however, wasn't done. At every opportunity, she tried to paint James's resilience as arrogance. "He just loves playing the victim, doesn't he?" she quipped during a community meeting. But her remarks only served to highlight her bitterness, contrasting sharply with James's unshakable grace. For James, the road was lonely and filled with challenges, but his determination never wavered. He believed that leading by example would eventually change hearts, even if the journey was slow. And through it all, he held on to the hope that kindness and perseverance would triumph over prejudice. The neighborhood meeting was supposed to be a routine gathering to discuss upcoming events and community projects. James Harper, as always, attended with an open mind, hoping to contribute positively. The atmosphere was light at first, with neighbors exchanging pleasantries and updates. However, the moment Karen Parker took the floor, the mood shifted. Karen cleared her throat, a calculated pause drawing attention. "I think we need to address something that's been on my mind for quite some time," she began, her tone feigning concern but laced with unmistakable malice. She turned toward James, her gaze sharp. "It seems that some people in this community are more interested in exploiting our resources for personal gain than contributing to the greater good." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to James, who sat motionless, his face calm but his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Karen continued, her voice rising. "Take James, for instance, always hosting workshops, always organizing events, but has anyone ever asked where all that funding really goes, or who benefits the most from these so-called initiatives?" A few murmurs rippled through the room, a mix of confusion and discomfort. Maria Lopez's eyes flared with anger, and she opened her mouth to interject. But James subtly shook his head, signaling her to hold back. He wanted to handle this himself, even if he wasn't sure how. Karen pressed on, emboldened by the lack of opposition. "I'm not saying we shouldn't support good causes," she said with mock humility, "but transparency matters, and I, for one, think it's fair to ask some hard questions." James finally spoke, his voice steady but strained. "Karen, if you have concerns about my work, I'd be happy to address them. Everything I do is for the betterment of this community, and I'm more than willing to share details about how resources are used." Karen smirked, her expression dripping with condescension. "Of course you'd say that, but actions speak louder than words, don't they?" The silence in the room was deafening. Some neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with Karen's direct attack, but no one spoke up. The weight of their silence was as painful as Karen's words. James, torn between defending himself further and avoiding escalation, decided to remain composed, even as the humiliation burned. Inside him, Maria's hand tightened into a fist under the table. Her anger was palpable, but she respected James's restraint. For James, the meeting was a painful reminder of how easily lies could overshadow truth, especially when silence allowed them to thrive. James sat alone in his living room, the faint hum of the ceiling fan, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. His hands rested on his knees, clenched tightly, as Karen's words replayed in his mind. Her accusations, the pointed stares from some neighbors, and the deafening silence of others, it all weighed on him like a boulder pressing down on his chest. He stared out the window at the quiet street, the shadows of the evening settling in. "Why is it always this way?" he muttered under his breath. The anger simmered just beneath the surface, his thoughts racing with all the things he wished he'd said during the meeting. But the anger clashed with something else, a deep-seated belief in the power of grace and dignity. James sighed and leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He thought about the countless times he'd faced prejudice, the subtle and overt ways people had tried to diminish him. Each time he had chosen to rise above, to meet hatred with composure, but tonight the weight of it felt different. The loneliness, the injustice, it cut deeper this time. "Am I doing the right thing?" he whispered to himself. "Does staying silent make me complicit, or does it make me strong?" The questions circled endlessly, each one sharpening the ache in his chest. James knew he couldn't let Karen's actions break him, but he also couldn't ignore the mounting frustration of feeling unsupported, even by those who claimed to respect him. He opened his eyes and stared at the photograph on the mantel, a picture of his late father, a man who had taught him the value of resilience. "What would you do, Dad?" James asked softly, his voice heavy with emotion. The next morning, Maria Lopez arrived at James's house unannounced, her face a mix of concern and determination. She knocked sharply on the door, and when James opened it, she wasted no time. "We need to talk," she said firmly, stepping inside before he could protest. Maria sat down at the kitchen table, her gaze piercing. "James, I've been thinking about last night. Karen is out of control, and you can't keep letting her get away with this." James poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her, his movements deliberate and slow. "I hear you, Maria," he said, his voice measured. "But what do you want me to do? She thrives on this kind of confrontation. Feeding into it will only make things worse." Maria shook her head, leaning forward. "You're wrong. What she thrives on is your silence, James. The more you let her speak unchecked, the more people start to believe her lies. You've spent years building respect in this community. Don't let her tear it down." James looked down at his coffee, his reflection distorted in the dark liquid. "It's not that simple. If I stand up to her, I risk losing the respect I've worked so hard to earn. What if it backfires, Maria?" Maria's voice softened, but her determination remained. "It won't backfire because you're not like her. You've always led with integrity, and people see that. Karen's actions are tearing this neighborhood apart, but you have the power to unite it. You just have to remind people who you are." Her words struck a chord deep within James. He nodded slowly, a spark of determination igniting in his eyes. Maria smiled, sensing the shift. "Good, because this neighborhood doesn't just need a leader. It needs you. Do you think James should confront Karen directly, or should he continue to rise above her actions with quiet resilience? What would you do if faced with a similar situation? Stand your ground or take a different approach? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about how to address prejudice and create stronger, more inclusive communities. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to keep the discussion going. The annual neighborhood block party was always meant to be a celebration of unity. The aroma of grilled burgers and freshly baked cookies filled the air as children played tag across the lawn, and neighbors chatted over picnic tables covered in checkered cloth. Laughter and cheerful conversations echoed through the cul-de-sac, creating a picture-perfect scene of suburban harmony. James. Harper stood by the refreshment table, his smile polite, but his mind elsewhere. The tension in his chest had been building since he arrived. Though he exchanged friendly greetings and brief conversations with a few neighbors, he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen Parker's presence loomed like a dark cloud over a gathering. He spotted her a few tables away, laughing animatedly with a small group of neighbors who had become her closest allies. Karen's gaze occasionally flicked toward James, and her smile carried an edge that felt less friendly and more calculating. James took a deep breath and refocused on the conversation he was having with Maria Lopez, who stood by his side. "Try to enjoy yourself," Maria said softly, reading his unease. "You have just as much right to be here as anyone else, and don't let her make you feel otherwise." James nodded, appreciating her support. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen had something planned. She thrived in moments like this, where her words could carry the weight of public scrutiny while cloaked in plausible deniability. As the evening progressed, James noticed a few lingering glances and hushed whispers. He wondered how many of the neighbors believed Karen's lies and how many were silently rooting for him. The party carried on peacefully on the surface, but for James, the sense of impending confrontation grew stronger with every passing minute. As the block party carried on, Karen Parker saw her opportunity to strike. Standing near a group of neighbors, her voice suddenly rose, cutting through the hum of cheerful conversations. "You know," she said, gesturing toward James with a smirk, "I still can't get over that Barack Obama cutout on James's lawn. It's a bit much, don't you think? Almost like he's trying to prove something." The laughter from her small circle was hesitant, more out of obligation than agreement, but Karen pressed on. "I mean, who does that? Does he think it makes him some kind of community leader, or is it just a way to remind us all how superior he thinks he is?" Her words were sharp and calculated, designed to humiliate James in the most public way possible. James, standing a few feet away, froze. The casual conversations around them began to falter as more neighbors turned their attention toward Karen. The laughter died down, replaced by an uneasy silence as the crowd processed the open hostility in her tone. Maria, who had been speaking with another neighbor, immediately moved to James's side. "Ignore her," she whispered. "She's looking for a reaction." But Karen wasn't done. She stepped forward slightly, her voice dripping with mockery. "I mean, honestly, James, what's the deal? Are you running for office? Or do you just like playing the hero? Because I'm not sure anyone here is buying it." The crowd grew even quieter. Some neighbors exchanged awkward glances, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. A few of Karen's allies chuckled nervously, trying to maintain their allegiance without fully endorsing her cruelty. James finally turned to face her, his expression calm, but his eyes filled with quiet strength. "Karen," he said evenly, "if you have an issue with me, I'd appreciate it if you brought it up directly, instead of trying to embarrass me in front of our neighbors." Karen smirked, undeterred. "Oh, I'm being direct, James. I think everyone deserves to hear the truth." For a moment, the tension was suffocating. The neighbors, caught between their discomfort and their reluctance to take a stand, remained silent. James felt the weight of their inaction, but he refused to give Karen the satisfaction of seeing him react in anger. Maria, however, wasn't as patient. She stepped forward, her voice firm. "Karen, you've made your point. Now why don't you let the rest of us enjoy the evening?" Karen scoffed, but didn't reply, her smirk faltering as the silence stretched on. The atmosphere remained heavy, the party's earlier joy replaced by an uneasy tension that lingered long after Karen's words. Maria Lopez had been watching the scene unfold with growing anger, her patience wearing thin as Karen's words cut deeper. She'd stayed quiet out of respect for James's composure, but when Karen's smirk widened after her last remark, Maria decided enough was enough. "Karen," Maria began, her voice sharp and clear, drawing the attention of the crowd. She stepped forward, positioning herself between Karen and James. "You've had your say, but let's set the record straight." Karen raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Oh, Maria, I'm just pointing out what everyone's already thinking." "Don't tell me you're taking this personally." Maria ignored the jab and pulled out her phone, scrolling quickly. It's funny how you keep trying to discredit James, but you conveniently forget the things he's done for this community and beyond. Let me remind you, she tapped on a video and held up her phone for the surrounding neighbors to see. The screen displayed a clip of James on stage at a prominent charity event, shaking hands with Barack Obama. The audio played loud enough for everyone to hear snippets of James's speech about fostering unity and breaking down barriers. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as Maria continued, swiping through photos of James hosting workshops, mentoring students, and collaborating with other community leaders. James has spent his entire life fighting for equality and uplifting others, Maria said, her voice steady but filled with passion. Unlike you, he doesn't need to tear people down to make himself feel important. Karen's confident smirk faltered, her face flushing as the evidence mounted. Well, she stammered, that doesn't mean he's perfect. People can still question his motives. Maria shot back without hesitation. Motives? His actions speak for themselves. What have you done for this community, Karen, besides spread rumors and create division? The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but this time, a few voices quietly expressed agreement. Karen, clearly flustered, tried to speak, but no words came out. Maria's boldness had stripped away her facade, leaving her exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated. Turning back to James, Maria placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You don't have to defend yourself to people like her, she said, her voice softening. Your work speaks louder than her words ever could. The crowd began to disperse slowly, their earlier discomfort replaced by a quiet admiration for Maria's courage and James's resilience. James Harper stood still, his heart pounding as all eyes turned to him. The tension in the air was thick, but Maria's unwavering support had given him the courage to speak. He glanced at her briefly, offering a small nod of gratitude before stepping forward to address the crowd. Thank you, Maria, he began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. He took a deep breath, letting the silence settle before continuing. I wasn't planning to speak tonight, but I think it's time I share my story, not just for myself, but for anyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong. The crowd shifted, the discomfort from earlier fading into attentive quiet. Even Karen, now standing off to the side, couldn't hide her curiosity. James clasped his hands together, his gaze sweeping across the group. Growing up, I learned early what it felt like to be judged, not for who I am, but for what people assume about me. I remember walking into classrooms and feeling the weight of expectations, or lack thereof, because of the color of my skin. I've been called names, overlooked for opportunities, and questioned for my intentions more times than I can count. His voice wavered slightly but grew stronger as he pressed on. But I made a decision a long time ago. I wouldn't let prejudice define me. Instead, I would fight it with kindness, with education, and with action. That's why I became a teacher. That's why I host workshops. That's why I work so hard to build bridges in this community, even when it feels like some people are determined to burn them down. He paused, glancing briefly at Karen. I know not everyone agrees with me or understands why I do what I do, and that's okay. What's not okay is tearing someone down simply because they're different, or because they challenge the way things have always been. James's voice grew quieter, but the sincerity in his tone made his words even more powerful. I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes and I don't have all the answers, but I wake up every day trying to make this world a little better than it was yesterday. That's all any of us can do. The crowd was silent, many visibly moved by his words. A few people nodded, while others exchanged guilty glances, clearly reflecting on their own behavior. James took another deep breath before concluding. So I ask you all to look around. This is our neighborhood, our community. It belongs to all of us, not just the ones who fit a certain mold or meet someone else's expectations. We're stronger together, and it's time we start acting like A round of quiet applause broke out, growing louder as more neighbors joined in. James stood tall, the weight of the evening lifting slightly as the crowd's response filled the air. For the first time in weeks, he felt seen, not as a target, but as a person with value, strength, and purpose. As the block party continued and the tension from James's speech began to settle, an unsuspecting twist was quietly unfolding. Unbeknownst to Karen, her tirade against James and Maria's passionate defense had not gone unnoticed by everyone present. Across the lawn, a tech-savvy teenager named Ethan had been recording the entire exchange on his phone. Ethan, a high school junior and an avid social media user, had started filming when Karen's voice first rose above the usual party chatter. At first, he thought it might just be a heated neighborhood debate, but as Karen's words grew more malicious, Ethan realized this was something bigger. His instincts told him to keep the camera rolling. The video captured everything: Karen's mocking tone, her unfounded accusations against James, and her smirking dismissal of his character. It also recorded Maria's bold intervention, her compelling defense of James, and the heartfelt speech that followed. Every emotion, every pause, and every reaction from the crowd was preserved, painting a vivid picture of the evening's events. Later that night, Ethan sat on his bed reviewing the footage. The rawness of the confrontation struck him, and he felt compelled to share it. With a few clicks, he uploaded the video to his personal social media account, titling it, "When Prejudice Meets Courage, a Block Party Turns into a Lesson in Justice." Within hours, the video began gaining traction. Comments flooded in, many expressing outrage at Karen's behavior. Viewers praised Maria's bravery and James's grace under pressure, with some calling for accountability and others sharing similar experiences of prejudice. The footage resonated deeply, sparking conversations about racism, community, and the power of standing up for what's right. By morning, the video had gone viral. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying its reach, and Karen's behavior was under intense public scrutiny. The neighborhood, once an isolated space for her actions, was now a focal point of national discussion. For Karen, the realization of her exposure came like a thunderclap. Her carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and for the first time, she was forced to face the consequences of her actions. Meanwhile, James woke up to an outpouring of support from both neighbors and strangers alike. The video, though unexpected, was a turning point that shifted the narrative and gave his story the audience it deserved. The morning after the block party, the neighborhood was abuzz with talk of the video. Karen Parker's tirade had become the focal point of conversation, and neighbors who had previously stayed silent were now forced to confront what they had witnessed. The footage made it impossible to ignore the prejudice Karen had displayed and the grace with which James had handled the situation. At first, the reactions were subdued, an occasional text or a quiet knock on James's door. One neighbor, Mrs. Coleman, arrived with a plate of cookies, her expression apologetic. "James," she said softly, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner. What Karen did was wrong, and I should have said something. You didn't deserve that." James accepted her words with a polite nod, grateful for her sincerity, but unsure how to feel about the sudden flood of support. Over the course of the day, more neighbors reached out, some leaving notes of encouragement, and others offering heartfelt apologies. Many admitted to feeling ashamed for not standing up to Karen sooner. "We should have done better," one neighbor admitted during a phone call. "You deserved better." Karen, meanwhile, found herself on the receiving end of the neighborhood's outrage. The video had stripped away her facade of civility, leaving her exposed as someone who thrived on division and cruelty. Her allies, The few who had echoed her whispers of doubt about James quickly distanced themselves. The same people who once chuckled at her jokes now avoided her altogether, unwilling to be associated with her actions. As Karen walked her dog that afternoon, the change was palpable. The polite nods and casual greetings she once enjoyed had vanished. Conversations stopped as she passed, replaced by awkward silence and averted gazes. Even the children, who had always waved at her from their yards, now turned away. By evening, Karen sat alone in her home, visibly shaken. The support she had once taken for granted had evaporated, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions in isolation. The community had made its decision, and the shift in perception was undeniable. James, the man she had tried so hard to discredit, had emerged as a respected and admired figure, while she had become a symbol of everything the neighborhood no longer wished to tolerate. Karen Parker sat in her living room, scrolling through the endless comments on the viral video. Each word felt like a punch to the gut. "How can someone act like this in 2025? Read one comment. "This is the type of behavior we need to call out," said another. Her name was everywhere, and none of it was in her favor. She had underestimated the power of the moment, believing her insults would stay confined to the block party. Instead, the world had seen her for who she truly was, and the backlash was relentless. Even her closest allies in the neighborhood had distanced themselves, their silence a loud condemnation. For the first time, Karen felt the full weight of her actions. Her confidence, once bolstered by her ability to manipulate and intimidate, was now in pieces. The reflection staring back at her from her laptop screen was unrecognizable. As she re-watched the video, Karen noticed details she had ignored in the heat of the moment. The discomfort on her neighbors' faces, the pain in James's eyes, the power in Maria's voice. These weren't the reactions of a crowd who admired her wit. They were the reactions of people seeing her cruelty laid bare. The realization hit her hard. Her actions hadn't just hurt James, they had fractured the very community she claimed to value. For the first time, Karen began to see the harm she'd caused, and with it came the faintest hint of regret. Have you ever witnessed someone's true colors being exposed in public? How did it change your perception of them? And how did it impact the people around them? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss the power of accountability and self-awareness. The video Ethan uploaded took on a life of its own, spreading across social media platforms faster than anyone in the neighborhood could have imagined. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times, accompanied by captions like, "When prejudice gets called out," and "Courage in the face of hate." The footage captured Karen's mocking words, Maria's bold defense, and James's heartfelt speech in vivid detail. It painted a clear picture of the confrontation and the underlying issues of racism and exclusion. Viewers were quick to voice their outrage in the comments, with many expressing disbelief that such blatant prejudice could still exist in their communities. "This is unacceptable," one user wrote. "How can someone act like this in 2025? Another commented, "James handled this with such grace. We need more people like him in the world." News outlets picked up the story, amplifying its reach even further. Headlines like "Neighborhood Confrontation Sparks Online Uproar" and "Standing Up to Racism, One Man's Courage Goes Viral" began appearing on major platforms. The video became a catalyst for broader conversations about prejudice, accountability, and the importance of speaking out against injustice. James was initially overwhelmed by the attention. Strangers from across the country reached out with messages of support, praising his composure and resilience. "You're an inspiration," one email read. "Thank you for standing up with dignity. The world needs more people like you." Karen, on the other hand, was thrust into an unrelenting spotlight. Her name and face were now associated with the video, and the backlash was swift. People demanded accountability, with many calling out the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. The video didn't just expose Karen, it shined a light on a larger issue, sparking conversations that extended far beyond the neighborhood. For James, it was a reminder that even in the face of adversity, the truth had the power to reach far and wide. A week after the viral video had made its rounds, Karen Parker found herself standing at the front of the community meeting room. The once confident woman now looked visibly uncomfortable, her hands clutching a prepared statement. The room was packed, more so than usual, as neighbors came to witness how Karen would address the storm her actions had caused. Karen cleared her throat, her voice faltering slightly as she began. "I wanted to take this opportunity to apologize to James and to the entire neighborhood for my behavior at the block party. My actions and words were inappropriate and hurtful, and I deeply regret them." She glanced at James, who sat silently in the crowd, his expression unreadable. "I let my personal frustrations get the better of me, and I said things that I now realize were unacceptable. This is not who I am, and I'm truly sorry for the pain I caused." Her words hung in the air, but they didn't land the way she had hoped. While some neighbors nodded politely, the majority remained stoic, their skepticism palpable. Karen's tone, though contrite, lacked the sincerity needed to mend the damage. Her apology felt rehearsed, as though it were more about easing public backlash than genuine remorse. As she finished, a few scattered claps broke the silence, but the response was lukewarm at best. The once powerful voice that Karen wielded in the neighborhood now seemed diminished, barely a whisper among the murmurs of doubt. After the meeting, several neighbors approached James to offer their support, while Karen was left standing alone. Her attempts to regain trust were met with polite indifference at best. The community had seen the truth, and no carefully worded apology could erase the harm her actions had caused. For Karen, it was a sobering realization. Rebuilding trust would require more than words. For James, it was a step forward, a quiet victory in a long battle for respect and understanding. In the days following Karen's public apology, James Harper found himself at the center of a wave of admiration and support. Neighbors who had once hesitated to speak up began approaching him, offering heartfelt words of encouragement and gratitude. "James, I'm so sorry for not stepping in sooner," one neighbor confessed. "You've shown us all what grace and strength look like." James's calm and measured response to Karen's actions, coupled with his powerful speech at the block party, had struck a chord far beyond the neighborhood. Social media continued to buzz with praise for his resilience. Messages poured in from strangers around the world, many sharing their own experiences with prejudice. "Your story reminded me of something I went through," one message read. "Thank you for showing us how to rise above." James, though humbled by the attention, remained focused on the larger picture. He saw the video and its aftermath as an opportunity to spark meaningful conversations about prejudice and accountability. At the next community meeting, he proposed a series of workshops on inclusivity and empathy, aimed at fostering understanding and unity within the neighborhood. His suggestion was met with enthusiastic approval. Beyond his immediate community, James's reputation as a symbol of resilience began to grow. Local organizations invited him to speak at events, and his story was featured in articles about combating racism at the grassroots level. Each opportunity gave him a platform to amplify his message of hope and unity. James never sought recognition, but his actions inspired others to reflect on their own behavior and take a stand against injustice. His journey became a testament to the power of resilience and the profound impact of meeting hate with integrity. Through his example, James turned a painful experience into a catalyst for change. As the dust began to settle, the neighborhood realized it couldn't simply move on without addressing the deeper issues Karen's actions had exposed. At James's suggestion, the community partnered with local authorities and social advocacy groups to organize workshops on racial sensitivity, diversity, and inclusivity. These sessions were designed not only to educate, but also to foster meaningful dialogue among neighbors. The first workshop was held at the community center, and the turnout exceeded expectations. Residents who had remained silent during the confrontation with Karen now came forward, eager to learn and contribute to the healing process. "I didn't realize how complicit I was by staying quiet," one neighbor admitted during the session. "I thought avoiding conflict was the right thing to do, but now I see how silence can enable harm." Facilitated by experienced educators and advocates, the workshops tackled challenging topics like microaggressions, implicit bias, and the importance of active allyship. Role-playing exercises and group discussions encouraged participants to reflect on their own behavior and understand the impact of their actions or inactions. James played an active role in these workshops, sharing his experiences and answering questions with patience and insight. His vulnerability and authenticity created a safe space for honest conversations. "It's not about pointing fingers," James explained during one session. "It's about recognizing where we can do better and committing to change, not just for ourselves, but for the next generation." Maria, ever the supportive ally, joined James in leading smaller group discussions, drawing on her own experiences to illustrate the intersectionality of discrimination. Together, they showed the community that change required both collective and individual effort. Even Karen, though hesitant at first, attended one of the sessions. She remained quiet for most of it, visibly uncomfortable, but her presence marked a small step toward accountability. The facilitators emphasized that growth took time and that the process of unlearning prejudice was ongoing. Over the following months, the workshops led to noticeable changes in the neighborhood. Neighbors who once kept their distance began engaging more openly with one another, finding common ground and building connections. The community also established a diversity council to ensure that inclusivity remained a priority. What began as a painful moment of division had transformed into an opportunity for growth. The workshops became a symbol of the neighborhood's commitment to learning from the past and building a more compassionate future, one conversation at a time. As James Harper sat on his porch one quiet evening, the cool breeze brushing past him, he allowed himself a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. The past weeks had been emotionally draining, filled with moments of frustration, anger, and doubt. Yet as he looked back, he realized just how much had changed, not just in the neighborhood, but within himself. The events surrounding Karen's outburst and the viral video had forced James to confront his deepest fears about being misunderstood and misjudged, but they had also shown him the transformative power of resilience. "I could have fought back in anger," James thought, staring at the setting sun. "But instead I chose to stand firm in my truth, and that made all the difference." James thought about the neighbors who had once avoided him, but now approached him with warmth and respect. He thought about the workshops on racial sensitivity, which had sparked conversations that might not have happened otherwise. "This neighborhood still has a long way to go," he murmured to himself, "but we're moving in the right direction." The experience also deepened his understanding of the importance of solidarity. Without Maria's unwavering support, James knew he might not have had the courage to face Karen's hostility so publicly. Having just one person stand by your side, he reflected, can make even the hardest battles feel less daunting. As he sipped his tea, James allowed himself to hope for a brighter future, not just for his neighborhood, but for society as a whole. If a single story can spark this much change, he thought, imagine what we could achieve if more people stood up against prejudice. James made a mental note to keep pushing for progress, not only through workshops and speeches, but also through everyday acts of kindness and understanding. Empathy, he whispered, is the bridge that connects us all. It's the key to breaking down walls and building a world where everyone feels seen and valued. With a deep breath, James smiled, feeling a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in weeks. The road ahead might still be challenging, but for the first time, he felt a profound sense of hope. On a crisp Saturday morning, James, Harper and Maria Lopez stood in the center of the neighborhood park, shovels in hand. Before them was a young oak tree, its roots wrapped in burlap and ready to be planted. A small but diverse group of neighbors had gathered to witness the moment, their faces reflecting a shared sense of anticipation and hope. Maria smiled as she glanced at James. This tree will stand for everything you fought for, James. Growth, resilience, and a future built on unity. James nodded, his voice calm but filled with emotion. This isn't just my fight, Maria. It's ours, all of ours. And this tree will remind us of what we can achieve when we come together. Together, they began to dig. The act was simple, yet deeply symbolic. Each shovelful of dirt removed felt like a step toward renewal, a deliberate act of laying the foundation for something enduring. As James lowered the tree into the ground, the onlookers stepped forward to take part, some handing over tools while others added soil. Their actions, speaking louder than words. A young boy in the crowd asked, "Why are we planting a tree?" His mother knelt beside him, smiling, because trees grow strong and tall, just like people do when they're supported and cared for. When the tree was finally secure, James took a step back and addressed the crowd. This tree represents more than just growth. It represents the commitment we've made to each other, to listen, to learn, and to be better neighbors. Together, we can create a community that thrives for generations to come. The crowd broke into applause, some moved to tears by the profound simplicity of the moment. The tree, standing firm in the soil, marked a new chapter for the neighborhood, one rooted in hope, understanding, and unity. Have you ever witnessed someone transform for the better after being held accountable for their actions? What impact did it have on them and those around them? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Let's discuss how accountability can lead to growth and understanding. Ask viewers to like, subscribe, and share the video to promote awareness about social justice.